The breath sequence wave. The energetic arc that I use to sequence a practice is a little different from the sequence I use for yoga classes, but it follows the same structure. If we teach a sequence to other people, we start with an intro or opening. When I teach pranayama, which follows the breath sequencing principles laid out in this book, I begin with an explanation that the goal and intent of the breath sequence. I then list all the exercises we will do and explain why I have chosen these and demonstrate how to do each one. To maintain the wave and ensure that my students get the most benefit physically and emotionally, I avoid disruptions to the flow of the practice. By explaining each technique before we start the sequence, I can cue and count the breath without having to stop and explain the next exercise. If we are not sharing our breath sequence with others, taking a moment to review our intention and memorizing the sequence will be just as helpful. The breath sequence wave has 4 components that act as a guide and tools to create a cohesive structure: the warm-up, heat building, vitalizing, and cool down. I build a sequence by starting with the vitalizing section, followed by heat building, and then I create the warm-up and cool down centered around the bulk of the class that lead me towards my goal. You might find it more helpful to compose in a different way, starting maybe with the warm-up and going in chronological order. The sequence wave is designed to be a tool to organize the energy arc. The order in which the sequence is created doesn't matter as long as it's practiced in the correct order. Depending on the goal, these 4 components might express themselves differently. A heat-building exercise for an energizing intent will be much different from a heat-building exercise for a relaxing intent. Each component of the sequence can have 1 or more breathing exercises, or a component might be omitted from the sequence if its energetics don't fit the overall intent. For example, you might choose not to create a heat-building exercise for a deep relaxation breath sequence. The length of each component depends on the duration and difficulty of the entire sequence. Generally, more difficult or intense practices will have a longer heat-building and vitalizing component. A more passive or subtle practice will place the focus on the warm-up and cool-down. If the duration of each section is similar, the sequence will feel more balanced. We can see that the energy of the gunas is present even when it comes to the structure of the sequence. The breath sequence wave is another tool that we can use to push the intention of our practice and express the energetic amplitude we want to convey. Before beginning the first sequence in an exercise, you want to check in with yourself without judgment and without trying to immediately change your current condition. In other words, establish baseline. If there is somewhere you need to go, the breath work will take you there. Begin by observing the quality of your breath, including the rate, rhythm, and depth. While you monitor this, you want to let it flow naturally. As you breathe, observe how you feel energetically. Are you low on energy, highly energized, or balanced? Also make a note of your emotional state. Notice if you feel calm, relaxed, or agitated. Anxiety or any other emotions arise as you sit with the breath. You should start every practice by observing baseline of your physical and mental condition so you have something to compare with how you feel at the end of practice. After establishing baseline, take a few moments to center in and create a connection with the breath. You can easily form this connection by taking a few long, slow, conscious breaths in and out through the nose. Adding a few holds can be helpful, especially if we are feeling anxious or agitated. Breath sequence wave. The warm-up. If you go for a run, you want to spend some time warming up your muscles. The same is true for breathing. You want to take adequate time to warm up the diaphragm and respiratory muscles. Consider the energetic quality or guna you wish to express. For example, if you are working with the Rajas guna to increase energy, the warm-up will be more intense compared to a sequence centered on the Tamas guna, or decreased energy. If the intent is sattvic, balancing energy, then the warm-up could be either or a balanced sattvic breathing exercise, or one that is more rajasic that is later resolved with a tamasic breathing exercise in the cool-down. It is important to note that warm-up doesn't mean easy. Warm-up is a relative term like hot or cold. Water at 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 degrees Celsius is cool compared to boiling water and hot compared to ice water. The intensity of the warm-up should reflect the energy of the breath sequence. If the sequence is challenging, then the warm-up should reflect the same difficulty. The primary purpose of the warm-up is to prepare the mind and body for more rigorous exercises to come while establishing sequence intent. Developing a warm-up can be challenging if you don't know what you are warming up for. As mentioned earlier, this is why I often create the vitalizing component first. Knowing what comes next allows us to foreshadow the rest of the sequence. Foreshadowing is an exercise where we allude to the practice that will be done later, either by modifying or varying the future practice or doing a similar type or style of exercise. For example, if the vitalizing component involves a long breath retention, then the warm-up should include a short retention. Foreshadowing isn't necessary, but it is a great way to introduce an easier variation of a more complex practice that will be done later in the sequence, which enables us to prepare for the challenge. Foreshadowing also gives the practice an overall cohesion and emphasizes our intent. If we decide not to foreshadow with the warm-up, we should consider the types of breathing exercises in the vitalizing and heat building section and choose warm-up techniques that build up to the later, more challenging exercises. The warm-up can be a singular breathing exercise that is repeated throughout the section, a slow ramping up of an exercise that starts easy and gradually becomes more challenging, or a series of several exercises that sequentially increase in intensity. The heat building component. The primary function of the heat building component is to amplify the intensity of the practice. Just like the warm-up, it needs to address the overall quality of the sequence while considering the vitalizing component and goal of the practice. In a breath sequence that has a calming or relaxed energy, the heat building section will be mild and seem more like an extension of the warm-up or a precursor to the vitalizing section. There are several ways to increase practice intensity. If the sequence focuses on Rajas Guna, then one option is to use a faster breathing exercise such as Kalapapati or Bhastrika. Any type of rapid breathing is going to stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, increase the heart rate and blood pressure, raise cardiorespiratory demand, and boost metabolism. These physiological changes build heat in the body and amplify mental energy and concentration. We can also use fast breathing techniques when the sequence centers on the Sattva Guna. However, we need to balance the rapid breathing with a retention practice. Some type of retention exercises will likely follow any practice that increase the respiration rate. Both rapid breathing and retention can be part of the heat building section or part of the same exercise. We can also use a fast breathing exercise in the heat building section to prepare for challenging Kumbhaka practice in the vitalizing section. Most pranayama practices stimulate the cardiorespiratory system and therefore already function to build heat and intensity. How we approach or use a breath practice in the sequence will give it context as to whether it belongs in that section of the sequence. It is the context of the sequence that we use to find the appropriate breathing exercises for the heat building section. Beyond building heat, this section is responsible for bridging the gap between the warm-up and the vitalizing section. The vitalizing component. This is a dynamic component, is the crescendo of the practice. It is where the intent or goal is fully realized and expressed. It is essentially the most important component because it gives the rest of the sequence its context. When choosing exercises for this component, we need to break down the goal of the sequence. Is there an emotional aspect? If we try to feel an expression of an emotion, then our primary concern is addressing this emotional aspect. Guiding emotions is very challenging, but following the breath is simple. Therefore, we need to be precise with our intent to follow the breath in a way that will create the emotional transformation we seek. The Vayus offer us a beautiful map to understand the movements of feelings and how to rebalance emotion. The Vayus address the imbalances of the movement of emotional energies and the stagnation that creates dysfunction and suffering. When we set a goal for an emotional change, we want to design the practice to bring us from the antithesis of that emotional goal. In other words, if we want a breath practice that makes us happy, we are creating a practice that assumes we are sad. But if the goal is something like be happy, then it would serve us to refine our understanding of the conditions of our unhappiness or our energetic imbalance, because an emotion like unhappiness has many causes. Once we define the source of the imbalance or the contrasting emotion of our goal, we can find where that imbalance lies in the Vayus and follow the breath to resolve that imbalance. Emotional practices are subtle and require a lot of intent to be effective. Mudras and visualization can be beneficial elements in aiding the purpose of the breath practice. What is the desired physical outcome of our goal? Are we trying to effect a physiological change? The physical aspect may be the main component of the goal, the increase in athletic performance or memory improvement. It might be a synergistic quality that supports our intent. For example, if the goal is to decrease stress and anxiety, we want to practice in a way that lowers blood pressure and pulse. When we are choosing pranayama sequences or other techniques, we want to consider their effects on the autonomic nervous system and other physiological changes that come from the breath, such as carbon dioxide and nitric oxide. Finding breathing exercises that affect us physically is much easier and more straightforward than it is for emotional goals. What is the energetic quality of our goal, Rajas, Tamas, or Sattva? The energetic aspect gives us insight into how we should breathe. We know that if we want more energy, we breathe faster. For less energy, we breathe slower. It's important to remember that some breathing exercises paradoxically increase rajasic energy and parasympathetic tone. There are also practices that increase the tamasic energy and sympathetic tone. But generally, the rajas guna follows the sympathetic nervous system and the tamas guna accompanies the parasympathetic nervous system. The cool down. The cool down expresses the resolution of the intent. Sometimes the cool down echoes a softer variation of the vitalizing components or mirrors the warm-up culminating the practice. Again, we need to consider the objectives of the practice and the energetic quality associated with our goal. With most practices, the cool down is one energetic step down from the intensity of the rest of the sequence. For example, if the energy of the sequence is rajas, then the cool down will feel sattvic. If the energy is sattva, then the cool down will feel tamasic. And if the energy is tamas, the cool down will remain at the same intensity. This ramp down in intensity, or sustaining of the tamas, gives a conclusive feeling to the practice and gives the sequence an overall impression of balance and harmony. If the intent for the sequence is emotional, then the cool down should reflect the intent so we are left feeling the intended sentiment. Again, accompanying the breath with mudras and visualization can be an excellent way to bring awareness to the emotional quality manifested by the intent. If the practice has a physiological goal, the cool down can serve to support or resolve that goal. When the entire sequence feels balanced, we choose milder practices for the cool down that continue to affect the physical outcome represented in the rest of the sequence. If the sequence leading up to the cool down pulls us too much in one direction or leaves us feeling out of balance, we resolve the goal with practices that counter the actions of the vitalizing section and restore balance. We usually only need to counter when the vitalizing section consists of breathing exercises that have too much sympathetic tone. Even when the goal of a breath sequence centers on increasing sympathetic tone, we want to conclude the practice with a more balanced autonomic nervous system so that we are able to return to the healthy resting breath. We never want our breath sequences to result in overbreathing or other poor long-term habits. Conclusion and check-in. After concluding the sequence, we want to consciously breathe for a minimum of 5 to 10 rounds to allow adequate time to return to the resting breath and reestablish good habits. We should also take time to check in with how we feel post-practice. Just as we took time to center in before, we should spare a few moments observing any changes afterwards. If we have created a new breath sequence, this time for observation gives us the opportunity to recognize whether the practice led us to our goal or if we need to make adjustments. I generally practice a sequence 4 or 5 times, adjusting every time until I feel it proves my intent. Once a sequence is created, it can be practiced as many times as is needed to fulfill your intent or bring you closer to your goal. Some sequences I do every day, like the athletic performance breath sequence. Others I do only when I feel a need. For example, if I have trouble sleeping, I do the sleep sequence. There is an old saying, if you do nothing, nothing will happen. This statement is not true. If you do nothing, something will happen, but it won't be the thing you want. Change is a universal truth. Either it is growing or it is decaying. Growth is a result of activity, and decay is a result of stagnation. Sometimes the path to positive change and growth is unclear, and it might take wandering to realize where you need to be. If you're unaware of where you are, where you came from, or the journey that led you here, how will you ever know what you need to do to manifest the change you desire? Fortunately, with just a few conscious breaths of awareness, you can observe the flow of your reality and recognize whether you are moving in the direction you want, fighting against an impossible current, or wasting away from stagnation. Science and philosophy can tell us only what we should be feeling or what should be happening, but we must observe our own intent and what comes to fruition. If we didn't get the results we wanted, we need to know how to course correct.